Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming tonight. I was a little bit worried because I heard a parable that was going around the church here. And this parable was about a couple that had twins. And when they were born, this couple was so poor they couldn't take care of the twins. So they had to put them out for adoption. And unfortunately, when they were adopted, they were taken far away from home and separated by two different families who adopted them. One was from Spain and the other was from Arabia. So, of course, the woman was very, very upset that her two boys were taken from her. And she wanted to stay in contact, and they were very lucky because the families both said, yeah, we'll communicate with you anytime you want. So they found out that the parents in Spain had named their boy Juan. They found out that the boy in Arabia was called Amal. So they continued to conversation back and forth between them, and they tried to follow their sons. And as they grew up a little bit, finally, the couple had enough money to visit one of the sons. There's no way they could go to both because it was very expensive. And they almost fought about it. I mean, the wife was saying, we have to see both boys. I can't choose one or the other. And the man kept saying, but we don't have enough money. We can't go to Spain and Arabia both. So they continued this up for some time, and finally one day, the man sat his wife down and said, I want to see both boys, you do, but we can't. So I've come up with the perfect solution. And the wife really doubted that. She said, well, what do you mean? He says, we're going to Spain. And she said, well, what about Arabia? He said, no, you don't have to worry about that, because if you've seen one, you've seen them all. So, even though you saw David this morning, maybe it'll be a little bit different tonight, hopefully, the sermon. I was in Tennessee, actually, when David told me that I would be able to preach tonight, and visiting my mother and my sister. And the hardest thing, I think, for almost any preacher, or especially part-time preacher, to do is find out what the topic is they're going to preach on. And so I actually switched topics a couple times, started on a couple, and I didn't quite get there with them until I met the husband of one of my friend's my sister's best friend. And he and I were talking, and he was, until he retired, an archaeology teacher for the Harding Graduate School of Religion in Memphis, Tennessee. So he was telling me about his job, and I was like, you had to go on a dig sometime. And he said, yes. He went to Israel, as a matter of fact, to Beth Shemesh. And I was like, wow, that's pretty neat. We talked, I found a lot of things about it. I found out that Beth Shemesh, well, first of all, he was there in 1997. When he got there in 97, they had already been digging there, and they're still digging today. It's a long time to try to unearth these things if you're an archaeologist. Two Israelites are the lead archaeologists, and they're going to, but have not yet, published the research on the dig. Beth Shemesh was pre-Israel. It's actually a Canaanite name, and the people of the land of Canaan established the village. When the Israelites took it over, when they came out of Egypt into the Promised Land, they took over the town, and it became a frontier settlement. In fact, it guarded the frontier border between Israel and Philistia. He was telling me that there's layers, they've been digging down through the layers, and it was interesting when they got to the layer right below the Israelites, the houses were even oriented differently. You could tell when the different people took over because they did things differently. They built things differently. The town continued under Israel from about 1100 BC to when they were overtaken by Babylon in 587 BC. The town didn't have a river nearby, and so what they had was a huge water collection system that collected and channeled the water to a cistern. But this wasn't just a cistern, this is a huge cistern. It was underneath the streets. It was so big that you walk downstairs, steps, underneath the streets to get water out of the cistern. They need that because it rains in the winter and spring, but it never rains from May until September. No one lived in Beth Shemesh after the Babylonians destroyed it until the 1940s. Today it's quite a substantial town of just over 100,000 people, but it's a short distance from the original. All these things I thought were very interesting that he told me, and it's kind of amazing how people who are archaeologists can look at ruins and see things that other people can't see. They can see things, like how the people lived and what they built, and they can find little things and learn about their lives. And yet what's interesting is that's what we do from the Old Testament in stories about towns like Beth Shemesh. And that's what I'd like to talk about tonight is what can we discover from the Old Testament? How can it affect our lives? What can we learn from that by looking at the book of 1 Samuel? Beth Shemesh is mentioned in the Bible in 1 Samuel. So let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 3 through chapter 6 and see what we can unearth. See what I did there? Unearth. 1 Samuel chapter 3. Very simply, Samuel was called by God in chapter 3. If you remember the story, 3 times God called to Samuel. He kept going to Eli saying, "What is it you want? You called me." Finally, the 3rd time, Eli tells Samuel, "That's God calling you." Isn't it interesting? And what I want to do is try to point out some interesting things. We're going through 3 chapters, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of it. But to me, I thought that could be a sermon. That's an interesting story how God talked to Samuel 3 times before he even realized it was God. We're always wanting a sign, or we want to talk to God. And yet, even when God talked to Samuel, he didn't recognize it. Does God ever talk in our lives? Does he ever make things happen in our lives that we should see that's God in our life? And yet we don't see it. In the very last of 1 Samuel 3, Samuel becomes established as God's prophet. Because God talks to him, he now becomes the prophet for Israel. Chapter 4. See how fast that first chapter was? In chapter 4, we find out in verses 1b through 2, now Israel went out to battle against the Philistines. They encamped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines encamped at Apec. The Philistines drew up in line against Israel, and when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field. So, Israel and the Philistines are at war. Israel's camped at Ebenezer, and you may have heard of Ebenezer before, but this is not "Here I Raise My Ebenezer," as in the song. That's 4 chapters away. That's in chapter 7, which we won't get to tonight. But that's also in 1 Samuel, "Here I Raise My Ebenezer." And that was a rock that Samuel put up saying God helped us, God aided us. The Philistines are camped at Apec, and the Philistines defeat the Israelites and kill 4,000 of them.
1 minute.
Wait, this is God's chosen people. How can they be defeated by the Philistines? How can they lose 4,000 men in a battle? And when the people came to camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of hosts, who was enthroned on the cherubim. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the Ark of the Covenant of God. As soon as the Ark of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. Israel says, "We've lost. I know what we'll do. We'll bring the Ark of God to the camp." When they did bring it, they raised such a great shout that the other versions say that the earth shook. Surely, this is going to get them victory. They now have the Ark of God, the Ark of the Lord, in their midst. verses 6 through 8 of 1 Samuel 4. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting mean?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid. For they said, "A god has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us! Who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness." So the Philistines find out what happened, that the ark had come in. What's interesting here is they had heard about the ark of God. They had heard about God's mighty power in Egypt. We know this had happened before when Rahab protected some of the spies, because she said, "We've heard what happened in Egypt. We know God's with you." Now the Philistines say, "Oh, this is the God that defeated the Egyptians. This is the God that led the Israelites out of Egypt, that freed the slaves and took them into this promised land, and now this God is up against us." Sometimes the people of the world have heard about God. And what's their reply? Well, I think sometimes they have the same as the Philistines. Because the Philistines say, "Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. And they fled, every man to his house. And there was a very great slaughter, for 30,000 foot soldiers of Israel fell. And the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. The Philistines said, "We have really but one choice, and that's to fight as hard as we can." The real question, I think, is why did the Israelites take the ark into their camp? Is that what God wanted done with the ark? Is that the purpose of the ark? Is to have it with you so that you win wars? Or is it to worship God? They were using it as something to guarantee their victory. And that was not the purpose of it. The Philistines fight, and in 1 Samuel, the rest of the chapter, verses 12 through 22, after the ark is taken, Eli dies. His daughter-in-law dies as she gives birth to a son, and she names him Ichabod, which means the glory has departed Israel, because the ark of the Lord had been captured. First Samuel chapter 5. The ark is now in Philistia. It's in the enemy territory, in the enemy country. They take it to a city named Ashdod. In 1 Samuel 5, the Philistines take the ark to Ashdod. And I think that's a great sermon, because I'm sure most of you are aware of the story about when it's in Ashdod. They set it in a temple of Dagon, and the next morning they come in, and their god Dagon is fallen down face first in front of the ark. And they said, that's crazy. That's never happened before. They set it back up. They come in the next morning, and once again it's face first in front of the ark. This time, though, the hands and the arms are broken off of it and sitting on the threshold, on the doorway. That's not enough, but God also plagues them with sickness and rats. They have tumors, and we find out that many got sick of that, and then the rats just infested the city, and people were dying from illness. It didn't take the people of Ashdod long to send it to Gath. Maybe you've heard of Gath before. Gath is the city of Goliath. That's where Goliath was from. It's another Philistine city, and the same thing happens there. There's sickness and rats. Doesn't stay there long, and they send it to Ekron. They send the ark away to the city of Ekron. The same thing happens there. The people of Ekron cry out, "They brought around to us the ark of the God of Israel to kill us and our people," in 1 Samuel 5:10. in 1 Samuel 5:11, b through 12, "Send away the ark of the God of Israel, and let it return to its own place, that it may not kill us and our people. For there was a deathly panic throughout the whole city. The hand of God was very heavy there. The men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven." It's interesting, the Israelites didn't know what to do with the ark of God, and so they misused it. The enemy gets the ark, and what happens? God shows his power. They send it to 3 cities, and each of the 3 cities, God shows his power in those 3 cities. So there were 3 suggestions made in 1 Samuel chapter 6, 1 through 5. For 7 months the Philistines had the ark, and the people decided to send it back to Israel. The leaders came up with these suggestions. Number 1, don't send it back without a guilt offering. We know this God's very powerful. We know we're guilty for taking this ark. Because of that, let's admit our guilt. Isn't it interesting that the Philistines did that when the Israelites wouldn't do that for so many years? Number 2, give glory to the God of Israel. Perhaps he will lighten his hand off of you and your gods in your land. Another thing the Israelites found very hard to do was to give God the glory. Here the Philistines said, "This is bigger than us. God is greater than us. He's not even our God, but we can see his glory." And number 3, the leaders of the Philistines said, "Don't harden your hearts as the Egyptians and the Pharaoh hardened their hearts." They learned a lesson from other people. They saw other people defeated by the Israelites, but not really by the Israelites, but by their God. And now they're seeing the handiwork of their God, and they said, "Don't harden your hearts. Recognize God and his power." That was 1, 2, and 3. 1 Samuel 6, 7 through 9a is part of what was read tonight. "Now take then and prepare a new cart and 2 milk cows on which there's never been a yoke, and yoke the cows to the cart, and take their calves home away from them. And take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart, and put it in a box on its side the figures of gold which you are returning to him as a guilt offering. Then send it off and let it go its way, and watch." So the leaders come up with this idea. What we're going to do is we're going to put the ark on a cart with a guilt offering, and then we're going to send it off. When we send it off, make sure you watch. See what happens. Let's make this a test. Let's see if it's just happenstance that this illness has come upon us, or if it is the Israelites' God that's powerful. They say, "And watch. If it goes to the way to its own land, to Beth Shemesh, then it is he who has done this great harm. But if not, then we shall know that it is not his hand that struck us. It happened to us by coincidence." By this, they'll know. If it goes to the Israelites' land, they'll know it was God, the God of the Israelites, that caused this. But if they go back, the cows go back to their home, where their calves are, where everything is that they're used to, then it was just a coincidence. So what happens? In 1 Samuel 6:12, "And the cows went straight in the direction of Beth Shemesh, along one highway, lowing as they went. They turned neither to the right nor to the left, and the Lord of the Philistines went after them as far as the border of Beth Shemesh." The cows went straight to Beth Shemesh. That's not the end of the story. In the last part of 1 Samuel 6, the ark was returned to Israel, but some of the people of Beth Shemesh were struck down. They were killed because they looked into the ark. Maybe that would be a good sermon, or maybe a good movie. Looking into the ark of the Lord and being struck down. So, 1 Samuel chapters 3 through 6 have interesting stories. It has some things that we can learn, but what can we learn about something in particular, especially on the cows? I'd like to focus on the cows now. Cows are very important in our society today. There are country songs like, I'll love you till the cows come home. I don't know if you guys heard that one, it's a good song. There are good jokes like, why do cows wear bells? Because their horns don't work. Or, what's a cow's favorite subject in school? Calculus. Or, why do cows have hooves instead of feet? Because they lack toes. Or one last one, what did the mommy cow say to the baby cow? It's past your bedtime. But we can learn from 1 Samuel, from the cows, that maybe this sermon, instead of being called Beth Shemesh, should have been named, What Can We Learn from Cows in 1 Samuel? As I was preparing this, it was interesting, last week Joe preached on, does anybody remember what Joe preached on last Sunday night? It was, is New Testament Christianity the problem? He talked about New Testament Christians and are we the problem in the world today? And he came up with the answer, no. Because New Testament Christians treat each other as they wish to be treated. Mark 12:31. They love their enemies. They help the sick and the homeless. They obey laws. They live in peace with others. They speak the truth in love. They're not anxious about anything. He listed many, many more than that. What was interesting to me was I got uncomfortable when he started talking about that. Because is that how the world sees Christians? Or does the world see Christians who are, instead of going straight and doing all those things, kind of wavering, looking around, seeing things that they like about the world, falling back, not always those things that we just talked about. Not always following as Jesus walked and walking as Jesus walked. If you notice the songs tonight, we're talking about walking with God and walking with Jesus. Walking as Jesus walked. Do we do that always straightforward? Is that how the world sees the church? Or does the world see us waver? What kind of examples are we to those that are watching us? We know that Romans 15:4 says, a couple behind, sorry. 15:4 says, whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the Scriptures we may have hope. This is telling us in the Old Testament that there's a reason for this, to study the Old Testament. Whatever was written in those days was written for our instruction. We should be able to learn things. Just like an archaeologist can dig through those and learn things about how people lived back then, we should be able to read the Old Testament and learn much about what God wants for us. That's why we've looked to 1 Samuel. The Old Testament gives us example after example of steadfastness and hope. In fact, a great example of how we should walk is right here in 1 Samuel. Things were really stacked against the cows. I don't know how many farmers we have here, but I'd like to talk about cows for a few minutes. I grew up on a farm in Iowa. And it's really interesting about this story because, number one, they had never been yoked. Not too many farmers anymore, in fact nobody, yokes oxen or cattle to plow. But if you did, or if you've ever read about it, you know that's like putting cows together without ever being yoked is kind of like riding a horse that's never been broken. I don't know how many people want to do that. Cows don't just say, oh, here, put the yoke on me, we're going to pull together perfectly. Because there's two of them. They've never worked together before. They've never been yoked before. They want to go this way, and when they go this way and the other guy wants to go the other way, they don't go anywhere. Cows do not just become yoked and work perfectly together. They've never been paired to make sure that they pull the same amount and in the same direction. It's an impossible situation, really. It was very interesting that this happened then. They were supposed to work together perfectly. To give us an idea of today, this is like putting together a Democrat and Republican together and having them work together. Or a conservative and liberal. Or a vegetarian and a meat eater. Or just on and on. This shouldn't have worked because they've never been yoked and worked together. That makes it very, very difficult. The second thing is their calves were taken away. If you've ever been with a cow who had their calf taken away, you don't stand between the two. In fact, some fences can't stand between the two. The cow will go through the fence to get to their calf. And here, they took these cows that had never been yoked, put them in yokes with a cart behind them, and then took their calves and put the calves away in the corral, back home. The cow is not happy. She'd go through fences or whatever to get to her calf. And yet here, that's what they're being asked to do, is just leave their calves and go the other way. And the third thing is, not only were they yoked when they hadn't been before, and not only had their calves been taken, but they were put in a situation where they could easily turn either way. They could turn toward Beth Shemesh and go that way, or they could easily turn back to home to get rid of the yokes, to get back to their calves. Remember the questions that I asked a few minutes ago? Is that how the world sees us? As examples of Christ? Are we always that way? Do we continue on the straight and narrow in all that we do, all that we say? What kind of examples are we to those that are watching us? Are we like the cows in 1 Samuel? If you remember, those cows were being watched. In fact, the Lord of the Philistines followed and watched to see what would happen. The people of the world watch us. Do we just talk about love, or do we walk in love? Do we just talk about being like Christ, or are we like Christ? The cows were being watched. They could continue on the difficult path, on the unknown road, or they could easily turn back and continue toward the calves and home. They didn't waver. The cows went straight in the direction of Beth Shemesh along one highway, lowing as they went. They turned neither to the right nor to the left. They did exactly what they were supposed to do. No matter how everything was stacked against them, while they're being watched, they went straight to Beth Shemesh. We're told in Luke chapter 9, verse 62, Jesus said to him, "No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." Do we do that? Do we look back? We know some other people who look back. Lot's wife. Do we look back and say, "Oh, the world, it was so easy. We had no difficulties then. We didn't have to try to forgive people, and we didn't have to love them no matter what they do or who they are. We have to love them as Christ loved them." Ephesians 4:14, "So that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine." We need to be stable. We need to be steadfast and not tossed about and waver. 2 Timothy 4, 3a, 4, and 5a. "For the time is coming when people will not endure sound doctrine, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander into myths. As for you, always be steady." Are we steadfast? Are we like the cows who went straight even when it got difficult? Hebrews 11:8. "By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going." God told Abraham, "Go." Much like the cows. Abraham didn't even know where he was going. And yet he obeyed God and went. 2 Corinthians 5:6. "We know that while we're at home in the body, we're away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not sight." Much like the cows. The cows didn't even know where they were. They'd never been to Beth Shemesh. All they had has been home with where their calves were now. And yet they went straight to where they were to go. "Ponder the path of your feet, then all of your way will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or the left. Turn your foot away from evil." Proverbs 4:27. "Let your eyes look directly forward, and your gaze be straight before you. Ponder the path of your feet, then all of your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the left or right, to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil. The writer in Proverbs in the Old Testament knows how important it is to keep looking. What do we look for? We should be looking for an eternal home with God. Not the things that are in front of us, not things that can distract us and make us act like people who don't believe in Christ. But we shouldn't swerve to the left or right. We should turn our foot away from evil and always walk to God. And 1 John 2:6. He who says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. Isn't it interesting that an Old Testament story about cows can be an example to us on how to walk? The chapters we've covered in 1 Samuel contain many stories for us to read and learn from. One is even about cows showing us how we should be steadfast and walk in the right path. Perhaps something tonight was said, something read, that makes you aware that you haven't walked as we are to walk, straight and with our sight on God, not on earthly things. Perhaps you've wondered and not been the example you should be. Perhaps you've considered the cost of following God and decided the reward, eternal life, is what you're willing to give up earthly things for. That you're willing to give up being in control of everything and letting God be in control. That you're ready to proclaim Him as your Lord, to confess and repent, to be baptized and to start walking in a new direction. If so, please make your way forward as we sing the Imitation Song, the song inviting you to walk with God, to follow Jesus.